This week, our topic is on strategies for integrating STEM. And in this overview week, we are going to be taking a look at your CTE courses and then using curriculum mapping as a tool to integrate and also be more explicit about the connections within the standards of science, technology, engineering, and math. The objectives for this week are to describe curriculum mapping and how this technique can make STEM concepts and standard performance expectations more explicit in CTE courses. Secondly, to explain how you can use curriculum mapping to be more explicit about STEM connections. And then your third objective is using the information communication tool this week of concept mapping. That's different. Curriculum mapping, concept mapping. One is actually a tool that we will use in instruction, and the other is sort of somewhat of a strategy for us to make sure we're explicit. That would be the curriculum mapping. But in the third objective, you'll be using a tool any tool of your choice to show me how you would use the strategy for doing some sort of formative or summative assessment. So those are the three objectives for this week. But let's get into a little bit about curriculum mapping. I'm not going to have you design a curriculum map, mostly because I think that many of you have done this within your school districts. You may have done it within your undergraduate preparation, or maybe you're on a pathways committee where you have this specific outcomes and you've mapped back through the outcomes back into the activities of what's going to take place within instruction to make it all happen. If you're not familiar with curriculum mapping, you may want to do a little bit more searching after this lecture just to make sure you're familiar with the term. But what I'm going to do here is sort of add just one more slice, if you will, one more component to curriculum mapping that will help ensure that you are more explicit about your connections to STEM standards. So essentially, you need to know where you are going and how you plan to measure your arrival. That's what curriculum maps are all about. Where am I beginning? And in this case, I've got, the house here, and how am I going to get, in this case, to a restaurant? Or I might be within my school setting, and how am I going to get to the outcome that's identified within my state's curriculum guides or standards? So how am I going to get there? And sometimes it's not the straightest route. Sometimes we take a jagged route because there's other things that we want to learn along the way. And that might be other concepts, or it might be things like soft skills, but we'll get into that in just a moment. So we have a destination. We have a particular outcome we're trying to achieve. And on the way, we're going to go through these towns, if you will. We're going to go through these places, standards and performance expectations if we're looking at next generation. And certainly performance expectations are part of career and technical education if you have a skills checkoff. So somewhere we're going to start, and we're going to hopefully get there by going through a bunch of activities or side trips or sometimes stops, outputs to our curriculum to get us to this home base right here, to get us to that actual outcome. And when we get there, before we get there, to make sure we're there, we're going to measure to make sure that we really understand the concepts, and we're going to either then stay right here in the car idling until we figure it out and can say that we have arrived. And I'll keep using that analogy. I really view this as somewhat of a map. We have a destination, we have lots of stops along the way, and when we are in Google Maps, you say, next is on your right, and then it says you've arrived. And you could take a photo of it saying, I've arrived. But in this case, when you've arrived, it means that we have some sort of measure or metric in place that says you've arrived. You've arrived at being able to somehow demonstrate, have some sort of performance of the knowledge that you have on that particular standard. So I think that that's, for most of you in education, curriculum mapping should be a somewhat familiar term. You also have a reading this week by Asunda, and it's on a conceptual framework for STEM integration into curriculum through career and technical education. So this was a good find. It's in the Journal of STEM and Teacher Education. But essentially, the author then is proposing a STEM integration model. And if you take a look at it, it's all a very pragmatic approach. It's housed deeply within this pragmatic lens, if you will, and that's pretty much what CTE is. We are all about the very practical. It's not an abstract area at all. And then within this framework, he's got systems thinking, goal orientation theory, constructivism, and situated learning theory. These things are explained within the paper and with the end goal of STEM literacy. You might also notice that PBL is a very big part of this paper, and we will be discussing PBL over a course of 2 weeks, and many of you already mentioned it in the discussion. It is probably the quintessential experiential learning way opportunity that we have in career technical education is to use project-based learning, but it's discussed a little bit more in this paper. And it's helpful this week as we take a look at the curriculum mapping. So there's a question within this week's discussion to ask about what resonated with you within this framework and how perhaps you see that playing out within your own instruction. The other document I'll draw your attention to that I took several examples from to prepare this overview is the National Agenda that's published on the National Academies Press. And next week you will be reading a chapter out of this text. But just to get you familiar with this, this is the National Academies that came together and basically developed the STEM integration for K-12 education. You're only reading one chapter out of there. I'm putting it here because those of you who are maybe overachievers and want to go scan a little bit early, great. You can go see what they said at the National Academies about STEM integration. Note that it is K-12, so there are a lot of examples there for bringing STEM into the elementary classrooms. And I'm not sure if there's a 50-50 split, but certainly also an emphasis on secondary classrooms. So a lot of the content here, this particular illustration, this figure right here is taken out of the National Academy's publication. And essentially what they're saying is this: we have integrated STEM education right here in the middle. Outside of STEM integration in education, these are somewhat of the concepts that should be thought about. And as I looked at them, I was thinking, well, they didn't put any arrows on here. I'm not sure any particular direction, but certainly outcomes are the end result. We can start there and say that's our outcome. But I'm going to start with the goals over here, the goals for students. The goals are STEM literacy. That means not just getting a STEM career, but that they can spot pseudoscience at 100 yards. They can listen to somebody say something like, I have an iPhone that has an app on it to pop popcorn, and know that that's probably not true, or that phone would explode. That kind of conceptual understanding about what really could or could not be, or how to use critical thinking to really assess and get assess and get evidence for various claims. So STEM literacy is a goal that's outlined in the integrated STEM approach. 21st century competencies. We've spent practically a week on these, so I won't go into that. STEM workforce readiness. It means that you have the skills ready to go. Interest and engagement, hopefully through the project-based learning. That's why I like that framework that Asanda presented. And then making connections, making those connections between, and that's transfer of skills, if you will. Some of the things talked about inside of the next generation science standards, where we have those cross-disciplinary skills, those kinds of things. The next item here is the nature and scope of integration. What does it look like? It's this type of STEM connections you're able to make, whether it's through the disciplines, and that means that you can see that there's a life science concept you're trying to cover, but it requires some sort of physical science or chemistry understanding or math understanding to really bring that discipline together. And we spent, I believe it was week 2 perhaps, discussing the transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary approaches to STEM, and I'll talk about that here in just a moment too. Duration, size, and complexity of the initiative is another area. You know, how big does it have to be before we have a real integration? And honestly, it needs to be somewhat all the way along, especially if we're going to say we are a STEM discipline, that we are covering STEM type concepts or standards. Implementation, what does it look like? What's the instructional design? What are the educational supports? And that means, what are the professional development? Adjustments to learning and learning in the environment. What does that really look like? Last is this area of outcomes, and I could have started with it first, but the outcomes then would hopefully be learning and achievement. That's obviously the content. That's probably at the recall level. 21st century competencies. The STEM course taking and educational persistence. That means that you have enough enthusiasm and you've made enough connections, you have enough interest and engagement that hopefully now you are being persistent within, in our case, a CTE discipline that uses STEM to get into the workforce. STEM-related employment then, STEM interest, and keep this in mind, that was a big part of the National Academies. Their big focus, and Judith Ramaley also from the National Science Foundation, they were really looking at this pipeline, really feeling like they didn't have enough qualified graduates to do STEM work. So that's a really important part within the National Academy's book. The development of STEM identity, that means that how you connect to the world of science, technology, engineering, and math. Or you might even, from what Dr. Greenhall was saying, was maybe connecting the development of a STEM identity and the ability to make connections among the STEM disciplines. Lastly, there are outcomes for educators, changes in our practice, and increased STEM content and pedagogical content knowledge. Changes in our practice is really to take a look, I believe, at the curriculum mapping and seeing where we can make and be more explicit about the STEM standards, STEM content, and then increase content and pedagogical knowledge about that. You know, if we don't understand the actual science behind the application, that requires us to do some professional development, some learning on our own, so we are able to really fully understand that and impart it either to the students through demonstration or some sort of student-centered activities. So I've just cited the particular article down here that this was taken from in the STEM integration. It's on page 31 through 50 that this is discussed. All right, curriculum mapping and integrating CTE and STEM content. Here are the steps really that you need to take. Review your CTE content standards and highlight standards that include STEM concepts. Not all of the CTE content standards will have STEM concepts. Some of them might be not as explicit. They might be the 21st century thing. They might be more process, and so they might not match up. Some of them might be more computational. So reviewing your CTE content standards and highlighting standards that include STEM concepts. Every standard inside of your courses may not be STEM inclusive. Not saying that they all have to be, but hopefully within some of your courses and some of the strands, there are STEM concepts that you can highlight through instruction. Within a science course, you would expect that 100% in that core science course, they should be connecting to a strand and standard. But in CTE, this is an area that we would like to have as much explicit connection as possible. But at the end of the day, we might have something a little bit different in mind related to the pathway or outcome. So not every single strand or not every single standard is going to be related to a STEM standard, but you should be able to find one in most of your areas. In fact, if you don't find one, send me a note and I'll see if I can help you out. Secondly, identify specific STEM standards and performance expectations. So now you review your CTE content, you look at those strands and standards and you say, that one right there, that is screaming some sort of science, technology, math, or engineering type of concept. So the first step would be to review your CTE content standards and highlight standards that include STEM concepts. Not every standard within your courses is going to scream STEM. It's okay. Find the ones that do and be explicit about the connections you can make there. You can highlight them. You can somehow copy them and put them into someplace else because you're going to want to use that later next week when we do the 5Es. 2, identify specific standards and performance expectations. So when now you know what you have for CTE, now you're trying to find how those relate, where's the overlap between the STEM standards or performance expectations to your CTE standard. 3rd, create a curriculum map. That's a table or a flow chart that maps how you will arrive at CTE content outcomes. Now you could use some sort of a concept map, but concept maps, if you call it a concept map, you really should be looking at concepts. You could call this a flow chart, some sort of a systems chart, any kind of other graphic organizer that you want. But when you actually Google this, you find people mostly create curriculum maps as a table. And I strictly believe that that is for the reader. It's something that's easy to look at inside of a binder. One of the limitations of using a table is that it doesn't show the messiness of curriculum. It doesn't show how, I need to go from point A to point B, but I'm going to make all these stops in between. It's a little bit linear. But when you look, you'll see that most of them are tables. Flowchart is fine. But essentially, that is going to map out, regardless of what you use, how you arrive at your CTE content outcomes, that skill or those standards, and explicitly go through the stops or the explicit connections identified in the STEM standards. So essentially, you've got the CTE outcome because that's what you really have on your mind. You really need to address that. But along the way, in those stops and activities that you have, you should also pass through those STEM standards. 4th, look at the 3-dimensional learning opportunities for increasing those levels of integration. And remember that chart, I'll show it to you in just a minute, that shows that you really want to increase integration. A good way to do that is to look at the 3-dimensional learning pieces that were outlined in the next generation science standards. In other words, it's not just the shortest route between point A and point B, because if you do that, you miss out on a lot of opportunities for learning, and they're, quite honestly, it's a bit messy. There's a lot to learn along the way. So this is what happens when you do a Google of images of curriculum maps. You do see a variety of tables, and if you scroll down through here, you would see that there are tons of other ways that people have graphically depicted their curriculum maps. Rather than having you all create something like that, I know that most of you have done work like this. I'm going to see if you are able to make the explicit connections within the 5E lesson plan that you'll be designing next week. Essentially then, this is a curriculum map table for STEM explicit integration. It is not complete in terms of all the things that a district or an administrator might want to see for a curriculum map. They may want you to go down even further and give very specific assessments. They might want you to actually be very specific about the strategies you're using. This is sort of that broad stroke. But what I've included here is the STEM standards and the three-dimensional learning. And that is another thing to add to whatever schema you use for developing curriculum map, or at least certainly into your thought process about developing instruction for being more explicit about STEM. So out here on the far left, assessment of outcomes. So this is the outcomes that we were hoping for. And remember, going back to the National Academy's graphic, we are looking at content. We are looking at the 21st century skills. We are looking at STEM literacy, and we're looking at career workforce readiness. This captures STEM and career and technical education. And of course, there would be very specific outcomes that you're having here. And I've got this placed over here in this next column, CTE strand and standard. I happened to pick one. I went to the TEE, Energy and Power and Technology area on the USBE or UEN website, rather. And on the UEN website, let me see if I can pull that up really quick. You can find the various standards. That's all I did here, was to look at Utah core standards. And if you're in a different state, you can find them, I'm sure, on one of your state's websites. But Utah core standards. And then scrolling down, I can look at career and technical education. And in this case, I took technology, engineering, education. And I could have just as easily chose agriculture. I'm just operating a little bit outside my comfort zone, just a little bit. But I decided to take a look at energy and power technology. Just randomly picked one and decided maybe this one would have something that would be useful to me. So when I go down through here, I see the strand. Safety was, I believe, at the beginning of everything, but the second strand was students will develop an understanding and be able to select and use energy power technologies. And there's the standards under each one. So now going back into my slides here and taking a look at the strand, energy and power technology, students will develop an understanding of and be able to select and use energy, power, and technologies. That should be something you just heard. And then standard one. Now, because my table has got some limitations of the slide, I didn't put all the standards, but essentially this is the standard. In order to understand energy, students should learn that energy is the capacity to do work. Energy can be used to do work using many processes. Energy and resources can be renewable, non-renewable, or inexhaustible. Energy can be classified into major forms: thermal, radiant, electrical, mechanical, chemical, nuclear, and others. And then energy cannot be created, destroyed. However, it can be converted from one form to another. I chose this one because I happen to know right off the bat that there's going to be some STEM connection between energy and this TEE course, this particular strand and standard. So I said to myself, okay, how am I going to find that? So if you remember, by looking at the NSTA web pages, and as you recall, my preference is to use the NGSS hub right here. You can search by keywords, you can look by topic, but if I scroll down, and I'm looking in this case at high school because this was a grade 9 through 12 course for CTE, TE class 9 through 12, I'm going to go right down to high school and say, okay, there is a particular topic on energy. What's there? How might I have some overlap between what's here and what's in the strands and standards in my content area in the course I'm teaching? So create computational model for energy as a component to system won't change. Energy flow in and out of the system. Well, that actually wasn't stated in that strand, but that sounds pretty interesting. And if I incorporated this into that particular topic area, I would be covering that performance expectation. Secondly, develop and use models to illustrate energy at the macroscopic scale to be accounted for a combination of energy associated with motion and particles. That wasn't quite there either. Design and build and refine a device that works within given constraints to convert from one form of energy to another. Now that might be an activity that would be supportive of one of those particular objectives within that strand, or standards rather. So emphasis on both the qualitative and quantitative evaluation of devices. Okay, I'm going to be looking at devices to convert from one form of energy to another. That one might work. What else is here? Plan to conduct an investigation to provide evidence of the transfer of thermal energy. Now, thermal energy was definitely inside of there. In fact, if I take a look here, the word thermal was right here. Energy can be classified into major forms: thermal, radiant, electrical, mechanical. All right, let's take a look about that again. An investigation, evidence of transfer of thermal energy. And here's the clarification statement. And I say to myself, okay, that looks like a really, really good connecting performance expectation. So I would put in the lesson, the instruction, that I'm not only going to be meeting that particular standard within my CTE area, but now I'm in that course, I'm also going to go through the town on my way to my destination this standard and make sure that it is part of my instruction. And that is to plan and conduct an investigation to provide evidence that transfer of thermal energy when two components of different temperature are combined within a closed system result in a more uniform energy distribution. And as you remember last week, we can actually highlight over this and then we'll underline the other disciplinary core ideas, cross-cutting in the engineering practices. And I can also click here and I can have that particular item all by itself. And also, if you notice, some of you pointed this out, there are vetted resources on these topics. So maybe there's a resource that's going to help me to convey that particular concept that I can make one of my activities within my curriculum. So that's just one example about how you might grab, in this case, HSPS 3-4, that performance expectation, and include it within your instruction. You may be saying, well, that actually is a performance expectation that is kind of beyond what I was going to cover in that on that very topic. On that topic of energy and motion and thermal, I was only going to really let them know that energy can be classified. That's a pretty low form of understanding, just classification. What the NGSS standard did was take it to the next level, and it had you to conduct an investigation, which will really solidify that concept. Yes, it will take more time. It is not the most direct route. But then you can actually say, I included this STEM concept, this performance expectation, this standard within my CTE course. If you can't say that and you've just done particularly this, you may have touched on an area of STEM literacy, but you didn't really cover the concept. And that's going to be the hard part where you might have to go get a little bit more professional development for yourself to make sure that you really understand the science. So that particular standard, develop and use models to illustrate energy at a macroscopic scale, that was the one I was just looking at. If you said to yourself, actually, I'm teaching this in a middle school, I got a bunch of 8th graders, I also found a standard by going to the middle school grouping, and it was apply scientific principles, design and construct and test a device that minimizes or maximizes thermal energy transfer. And it was actually a great lesson plan with that one. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this middle school one. Apply scientific principles, maximize thermal energy. See what that one looks like. If you start back here inside of middle school, we were looking at high school. And if you go into middle school, you'll see that they have the energy as well outside of physical science right there. And then there's an item here, a performance expectation, taking a look at thermal energy, which is this one right here. And it has a little gear behind it, meaning there's probably going to be some more resources related to the instruction of this one. Clarification statements, scroll down. In fact, there are, this one I think most of you have seen, creating a solar oven. This then is appropriate for the middle school level for understanding that thermal energy. So you can take it both ways depending on the way that you search. And of course, again, as you highlight this, it shows you the science and engineering practices, disciplinary core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts. So that gives you the STEM standards. That's the way that you're going to make sure that your content is driving through those STEM standards. I put this three-dimensional learning category here because I feel like this is a real opportunity, especially in career and tech ed. Science and engineering practices, what else am I doing besides covering content? I'm having the students develop and use models. I'm having them plan and carry out investigations. I'm having them analyze and interpret data. These are all important parts of the 3 dimensions, or part of the learning that were explicit in the outcomes of assessment, both in the CTE outcomes and in the STEM outcomes. Cross-cutting concepts. Are they in any way in any of the activities I'm having them go through? Are they going to be learning about cause and effect, looking at patterns, energy and matter, obviously, structure and function, and then of course disciplinary core ideas. both of these standards came out of the P. That has P's, that's a P, that means physical science. So that's the core disciplinary ideas. So if you've done curriculum mapping before, and the ones that we just saw when we did the Google search with all the different columns, and I didn't even open any of them. I mean, there's so many different ways to do this. These are actually some additional columns. But I'll be looking for this in your 5Es. I'll be looking for you to identify for me the CTE standard that you're covering, as well as the STEM standard. And you'll tell me whether it was a STEM standard related to science, and you found it in Next Generation Science Standards, which I think is the easiest way to locate these things. You could also go to your state standards, and some of them, they don't have as great as search features, but you can use Control or Command F within the documents to find keywords. So I'm perfectly good with you finding these nationally used, these next generation STEM standards. You can also use the technology, the national technology. There are no national engineering or the national math standards or your state math standards. I'm just going to want you to make sure that you do drive through at least one or more. And if you cover the 3 dimensions in addition to going like at the next generation, you will definitely be covering those, because remember, inside of the next generation, with these science and engineering practices, now you've covered the E. So you have the E, you have the S, and then we have some sort of cross-cutting concept. So we're probably cutting across. Oftentimes there'll be a math connection here or something else. You've got at least 2 or more inside of your particular area of instruction. All right, so that's the table, if you will, for making sure that you make explicit connections and looking for how to search. In the instructional piece here, I'm going to ask you this week for your engagement to develop a concept map. And I don't want you to develop a concept map around this curriculum map. I want you to develop a concept map like your students would, in this case, using energy or a classification for linking examples about energy. The standard over here was to look at energy and have the capacity to do work, and they're able to categorize, classify them into major forms. In fact, that's a great example. Energy can be classified. Maybe your concept map that you're going to submit is a concept map about energy classifications, and you would have in the middle energy classifications, and then you would have the other ones out there on the outside, and from that you would be having good examples, linking examples of types of energy like radiant, electrical, mechanical. This would just be one example that you could use for your curriculum mapping assignment engagement activity this week. You can take your very own discipline and provide an example of how you would use that information communication tool to develop your own concept map within your discipline. So instruction and the approach that you have, many administrations, how are you going to conduct that? What's the title of your lesson plan? What teaching strategy are you using? And in this case, we are actually going to use the strategy of a concept map as practice this week in our engagement. You'll also see that on these particular maps, many of the maps, they say, when do you do this? What season is this going to take place? Is it a seasonal thing? If you're in ag, is it a seasonal thing that we need to do in terms of starting plants and seeds and that sort of thing? So you'll lay out, I'm doing this in August, I'm doing this in September, I'm doing this in October. That's another thing that you'll see that's a commonality within the curriculum maps. So this week I got a question from somebody who was working on a lesson that said, I'm trying to make an explicit connection to science. I have a lesson that is a comparison of organic and conventional produce. It lacks good application to science standards. Can you think of anything applicable for this type of lesson flow? Conventional versus organic taste tests obviously is an activity they want to do. Understanding toxicity levels, the measurement or quality or quantity of an actual substance, for example, parts per million, etc. Critical thinking piece on things like the Dirty Dozen, which is a list of that many of you may have seen out on social networks saying you should not eat this food. That list comparing the use of synthetic versus organic or approved chemicals. So in this case, this person has a lesson plan idea that meets an agricultural literacy outcome, but is really struggling to find some sort of science connection. So if you go and you take a look at Next Generation Science Standards, you say to yourself, how am I going to search this? And remember, we can search by topic. At first glance, I say to myself, toxicity levels, maybe that's something in human health. Pieces like the Dirty Dozen, maybe organic chemicals, but synthetic, a comparison between synthetic and approved chemicals, I'm not sure that's going to show up in a chemistry, but maybe. But more importantly, I have to step back one step further and say this critical thinking on things like the Dirty Dozen, making those kinds of comparisons and why humans might do that. So then if you head on over to the Next Generation Science Standards by topic, and in this case, they could have looked at their state standards again, but I scroll down into high school and I think to myself, what might be here? Well, why do we have these types of these particular types of chemicals. Maybe I can look in human sustainability. Maybe it's there. And there's also one here on human impacts. I'll take a look on human sustainability. As I look inside there, the topics come up and it's got several choices, but this one down here, evaluate or refine a technological solution that reduces the impact of human activities on natural systems. If you open that one up, evaluate and refine a technological solution. Well, chemical agriculture, if you will, is a response to something happening in the natural world, and it's a technological solution. So if we look at that particular item, I can open it up right here. You can see then the various science and engineering practices, the disciplinary core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts. And to evaluate that particular item, if you highlight over it, the engineering design is to create or refine a solution to a real-world problem. In this case, the real-world problem is insects, or the real-world problem is weeds. And then on the core disciplinary ideas, you would say, when evaluating solutions, it's important to take into account the range of constraints. So this gets at that last item that she was asking about, which is there's a critical thinking piece in there. I got to take into account the range of constraints, cost, safety, reliability, aesthetics too, and considering social and cultural environmental impacts. So that fits pretty nicely into the disciplinary core ideas. Then lastly, engineers continuously modify these technological systems by applying scientific knowledge and engineering design practices to increase benefits while decreasing costs. So in this case, it would be the chemical engineers who are taking a look at how to make something less toxic in the environment and still control the problem that you have. So this, as I looked throughout the various options, was the tightest connection I saw to this question about what is a possible science standard that we could use with this particular lesson or topic. Sort of thinking that you're going to have to deploy when you're looking at your content. So in instructional methods and strategies, remembering that last category, I've heard those terms used interchangeably. Some people say strategies is a big term, like instructional, direct instruction, indirect instruction, experiential learning, that's the strategy. Others say, no, methods, these are the methods above, the big bold letters, and then the underneath are the strategies. That's my preference for looking at these. But essentially, if you have experiential learning, what we typically look at, and that would be in that last column for instruction, we're talking about field trips, conducting experiments, games, fieldwork models, building, manipulating, playing, simulations, project-based learning, and storylines. So if you went back to the that chart, right here would be the instructional approach. I've provided some ideas for what that might look like within this slide right here. And that is just identifying what it is you're going to use to convey that concept or that content. So when you're looking at this integration process and this graph, this increased plane was something I think we discussed in week 1 or week 2. You have the disciplinary, you have the multidisciplinary, you have the interdisciplinary, and then the trans. And that's really kind of the big goal where you have understanding of real world problems and projects. Students apply the knowledge and skills from 2 or more disciplines and help shape the learning experience. But even getting into multidisciplinary and or interdisciplinary is a good place. Staying within, that means you're doing a straight line to your destination. You really want to have more of a jagged, learning, messy approach so that you cover these practices, core ideas, and cross-cutting concepts. So the benefits of curriculum mapping is it ensures a plan for achieving standards. If you have your standard out there that you're trying to have, and then you've also plugged in one of the STEM or maybe 2 or more of the STEM standards, then that ensures a plan of achieving what you're trying to achieve by integrating STEM and CTE. Curriculum mapping, that highlights the opportunities for an intentional cross-curricular for student real-world application, as we just saw in that multidisciplinary approach. Curriculum maps provide a framework for building instruction based on the progression, sometimes related to calendar appropriateness. So that's why you have that last little column inside of the curriculum map, that sometimes what you are doing requires that you do it at a specific time of year. And that's really very important, especially those of you in the ag concentration. The map outlining instruction aids in creating a balance between teacher-directed concepts and student-generated investigations. So in that column, when you're looking at methods and strategies, let's go back to that slide really quick. You can decide whether you have way too much direct instruction inside of that column and that you need to diversify things out so that you are using some different types of approaches to teaching and learning that will definitely connect with that content. All right. The map outlining the instruction aids in creating that balance. And then lastly, the curriculum mapping can also facilitate assessment planning. So you have it all there. You know what you have to measure. Now you have to think about the creative ways, going back to the ways the students investigated that topic to see what assessment you can use as a demonstration of their knowledge or learning of that particular area. And oftentimes it will be a performance. And then periodic self-assessment and assessment using rubric promotes that awareness and strengthens that area of improvement. That will typically be outlined in the instructional piece. That's the topic of next week when we look at the 5E model. So essentially, for curriculum mapping, know where you are going and how you plan to measure your arrival. It is not always a straight line to get way up here into what looks to be Portland, Maine, starting in Sacramento. Rather, you're going to be taking the scenic route. You're going to take a route that you go through the different standards, the different investigations, the soft skills, the practices to get there to learning. It doesn't have to be a linear flow. And I think by using the curriculum map, you can get there as efficiently as possible, but still making sure that you go through those essential stops, activities for them to be more STEM literate and to also understand the CTE core concepts that you're trying to communicate.